Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each episode of this podcast is either an episode with a guest or multiple guests, or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Intersections of Popular Musicianship and Computer Science Practices by Jared O'Leary. That's me. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, "Since the introduction of music education within public schools, curricular offerings have not developed in parallel with the myriad of practices popular musicians engage with outside school contexts. In other academic disciplines, such as computer science, curricula and practices are iterative in nature and are responsive to the ever-changing practices that people engage with outside educational contexts. Although popular musicians are using computer science practices for music-related purposes, such practices are seldom discussed within music education scholarship. This article begins with an exploration of such intersections by describing hardware practices popular musicians use to modify, design, or build electronic devices for music-related purposes. The following section introduces coding practices that people use to create and modify music software, as well as to make music with code. The article concludes by unpacking potential implications and considerations for educators interested in the intersections of popular musicianship and computer science practices." End quote. If I were to summarize this article into a single sentence, I'd say that this article discusses potential implications of hardware and software practices that blur the boundaries between music making and computer science. Now, I have to admit, it is a little weird for me to kind of unpack my own papers. I've done this before in the Affinity Space episode and in the episode on working with trans students that was written by trans educators. But because I'm kind of in a unique position in that my background is in music education and I've been working on computer science education for the last several years, and people have expressed interest in this intersection, I figured I should talk about this particular paper. You can find a link to it in the show notes, which is available in the app that you're listening to this on by clicking the link in the description or by simply going to jaredoleary.com and go into the podcast tab. While you're on my website, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of resources relevant to computer science educators, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I create curriculum for and collaborate on research grants with, as well as some other content I create related to gaming and drumming because I'm that kind of nerd. All right, so in the opening section of this paper, I contrast music education, which was first introduced in public schools in 1837 by Lowell Mason, with STEM and CS education. So for music education, honestly, not much has changed since it was first introduced. There are some more ensembles, but those ensembles usually have about like a 20 or 30-year lag time between when it's popular to engage in that kind of music outside of school and when it's finally introduced in schools. Now compare this with computer science and STEM education. What's going on outside of schools in terms of how people engage with computer science and STEM is often also how they engage with it in schools. And what's interesting is there have been many computer science educators and scholars who have explored this intersection of music and CS, but there haven't been many music educators talking about it. So in this paper, which was written for music educators, I wanted to explain like, hey, here are some really interesting hardware and software practices that people are doing that kind of blur the boundaries between music making and computer science, and then talk about, well, what are the implications for this, both in terms of for music educators and for computer science educators. So in the first main section of this paper, I discuss hardware practices, and specifically hardware practices that blur those boundaries between music making and music learning with computer science and electrical engineering by like modifying, building, or designing electronic devices for music-related purposes. Now, these music-related purposes are often related to enabling music making or enhancing or extending music making in some way. And one of the interesting findings from my dissertation is that although these like practices related to electrical engineering and reading circuit diagrams and schematics and manufacturing devices are typically practices that are outside of music education context, like not discussed within them, the musicians that I studied online in a discussion forum, over 10,000 members in there, often expressed that these practices were essential for the music making practices, which is really interesting. So let's talk about some of them. So the first subsection is on circuit bending. So picture a battery-operated children's toy, like a Speak and Spell, or one of those toys where when you spin the wheel, whatever animal it lands on, it makes a sound that matches that particular animal. So if you were to circuit bend a device like that, you would basically take a wire, you touch one end of the circuit with the wire, and then you touch somewhere else, some other metal part, and then you'd see how it changes the sound, if it does at all. So what can happen with this is by changing the voltage, it can actually add all sorts of different effects. So for example, with the speak and spell, Ghazala, who's like considered to be the person who discovered circuit bending, found that there was 6 different types of circuit bends with the speak and spell. Now, these different systems allowed you to loop back audio or change the pitch. Like you'd add in a potentiometer, so when you turn the knob to the right, you might get more signal, and when you turn it to the left, you get less signal, and that'll change how fast the audio signal moves through it, which will make it so it gets higher and lower, as well as faster and slower. There's bends called body contact vibrato, where your body's electrical conductivity literally impacts the pitch of the device. So depending on how you move or how close you are to the device, it'll actually change the vibrato, which kind of gives that like ghostly vibrato effect or whatever, etc. So if you want to read a little bit more about that, check that out from page 156. But here's a little section on that page that I want to read that basically explains how to do circuit bending. And this is from Ghazala. Quote, A, begin with a low voltage battery-powered circuit that produces sound and touch on one end of conductive wire to a circuit and the other end of the conductive wire to another point on the circuit. B, if there's a sound or change in an existing sound, mark the start and end locations and move on to another endpoint on the circuit. C, once all possible endpoints are tested with one starting location, move to a new starting location and repeat the previous steps. D, when all possible combinations of start and endpoints have been tested, Ghazala recommends creating permanent connections between marked locations by soldering switches, buttons, or potentiometers to the electronic device to manually break or adjust the voltage of a discovered bend, end quote. So then once you've done all that, you could perform with the new device, you could record the audio for it, and then create sample-based recordings, like make a beat or a melody or whatever. So there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with these circuit bent devices. And this is a relatively cheap and easy way to experiment with hardware practices that kind of blur those boundaries between music making and some CS practices. So the next subsection in here is on hardware modifying. So here's a quote from page 157 that I want to read. Quote, rather than creating music with pre-manufactured musical instruments, students can modify electrical hardware to create new musical instruments or interfaces for creating or modifying music, end quote. So for example, the original Game Boy was designed to have headphones plugged into them, not designed to record out of, not designed to perform over loudspeakers, etc. So the original design of the device actually didn't have great sound quality when you'd plug in an audio jack and try and record it or project it. So what people did is a process called Pro Sound Mod. So to do a Pro Sound, you basically rewire it so that instead of coming out of the audio port that's built into the Game Boy, you create 2 new ports, one for each channel. And this actually gives you a cleaner and louder signal. So people would use this to perform with, record with, etc. Now, another example of performing that takes it to the next step that I provide in this particular article talks about Moldover and how they augment MIDI controllers by adding in some new buttons, knobs, keys, pads, etc., to make it so they could actually do more with that controller than it was originally designed to do. Now, if we dive even deeper into the hardware practices, some people will actually design and manufacture new devices specifically for music-related purposes. And this can be for both electronic instruments as well as acoustic instruments. So as an example for electronic instruments, in my dissertation, I found that the chip musicians in the discussion forum that I explored or investigated would often design interfaces that allowed them to connect retro consoles, like video game consoles, with modern devices like their PC or Mac. And so this made it so that they could actually control the sound chip of like a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive using MIDI information sent from like their laptop. All right, so that's a very quick summary of the hardware practices. So we have a range from like tinkering and experimenting with battery operated stuff to adding in buttons, knobs, etc., or modifying devices to be able to make music with it, or even designing and manufacturing new devices that enable new ways of making music. Now, these practices are pretty atypical forms of engagement in school music curricula, at least in the K-12 context. However, there are many institutions in higher education that are actually exploring these contexts in music technology programs or computer science programs. Now, on the software side of things, or the coding side of things, we have some other really interesting practices that I discuss in the next section of this paper. But one of the really interesting findings from my dissertation is that there was a discussion forum topic where somebody asked whether or not coding practices were considered to be off topic for music making. And members responded with comments such as, quote, I think it is more than on topic, and it is interesting to read even if I barely understand anything, end quote. And then I include a citation from another book by Huggle. This is from page 209 of the book, or from page 158 of the article. And the quote is, "In order to escape the limitations that commercial software imposes on the musician, I think it is important to be able to work in an environment where you are free to compose your own instruments or tools," end quote. So in other words, engaging in coding practices to enable or expand music making. Like when I mentioned the Game Boy, there wasn't software for composing and performing with Game Boys. Nintendo never released anything like that. But because people wanted to make music with those devices, fans of the Game Boy wrote their own software called trackers and allowed them to compose music and perform music with Game Boys. So in the next subsection on creating and modifying music software, that is an example of people who create software to be able to make music. And this was actually born out of mod practices from the demo scene, where people would modify the introduction to a game to kind of demonstrate their prowess in coding by adding in new graphics and new sound effects and music, etc. But it eventually spun off into its own music-related practice known as chiptunes, where people would just create software or just write music with software, often in the form of trackers. And I include a screenshot on page 159, figure 1, which shows a tracker for Little Sound DJ, LSDJ, on the Game Boy. So you can see what it looks like. Now, although a select number of people ended up creating trackers like LSDJ, a larger number of people actually modified them for their own purposes. And this was enabled because many of the original creators would release the source code and encourage modification. They were often doing this part-time for fun and couldn't add in all the features that other people wanted. So they'd share the source code and say, hey, if you got a feature that you'd like to add, go for it. And then those people would share their mods of it. So how this applies to music education and CS education in the K-12 context is, quote, "Rather than using prepackaged music software with inherent limitations and biases for certain modes of music making and learning, students might augment or alter the code of music software to not only tinker with inherent constraints, but to circumvent such constraints," end quote. So as an example of a constraint, what if you have music software that makes it so you can only play between 100 and 200 beats a minute? What if you wanted to go slower than that? What if you wanted to go 80 beats a minute? Or what if you wanted to go really fast, like 250 beats a minute? Well, you could simply go into the code and change the minimum and maximum for the beats per minute. This allows you to increase your tempo range, and it's just a very simple example of how you might modify software to remove constraints that are designed into it. Now, some software actually encourage this. So in digital audio workstations, also known as DAWs, D-A-W, there are programs called Virtual Studio Technologies, or VSTs. And so these VSTs basically are like add-ons for your software or expansion packs. So it allows you to open up these little sub-programs that enhance the software in some way. And so people will often code and share their own VSTs with other musicians and programmers, so that way they can make music in ways that were not originally designed into the software. Now, while many music educators that I've spoken with would probably look at that and go, okay, well, you're just programming software, so what does that have to do with music making? And what I would argue is that you need to know both music and computer science concepts in order to be able to create music software or add-ons like VSTs and whatnot. So here's a quote from my dissertation from page 215. Quote, "Consider a simplified example of what a person would need to know to enable user-controlled volume within a tracker. From a music education perspective, a person would need to understand that sounds and music can change volume, and they might label that concept dynamics, volume, or even amplitude. From a computer science perspective, a person would also need to understand that a symbolic label can keep track of a value that changes through user interaction, and they might label that concept a variable. Without understanding that volume can change, music education concept, and that a variable that represents the numeric value of the volume can change through user interaction, computer science concept, a person would be unable to create this simple interface. This simplified example demonstrates a person would apply concepts from both disciplines to enable user-controlled volume within a tracker," end quote. So in other words, yeah, you might be spending a lot of time coding, but you have to understand music, and you're creating a program for music-related purposes. So I personally would argue that, yeah, this is very relevant to music educators, and obviously computer science educators. Now, that part of the intersection of programming and music, it might be a little foreign for a lot of music educators, and they might still be like, yeah, I don't know about that. The next two subsections in here are on composing with code and performing with code. So for example, you could use ear sketch to compose with code. So you could write out a bunch of beats and whatnot, create some melodies, create entire songs, remixes, etc. using code. But you could also perform. So programs like Sonic Pi and others allow you to perform live, which is a process known as algoraving. So in an algorave, somebody might take a laptop, plug it in so that you can see the screen on a projector, and then plug in the audio to some speakers, and they will code out live music. So I will include some links in the show notes so you can see what this might look like. But basically, every sound that you hear, you write out lines of code for, different arrays, different control structures, etc., to create like an improvised performance through code. All of the beats, all the melodies, etc., are all performed live, and because you're projecting the screen, you can actually see every line of code that's being used to create and modify the music. However, there are some other interesting coding and performance-related practices that Collins mentions in one of their papers. So here's a quote from page 161 that kind of mentions some of these different examples by Collins and then Salazar and Armitage. So, quote, A, using the human body's ability to conduct electricity to make and break electrical connections by touching conductive objects that trigger music-related algorithmic sequences. B, touching artwork where segments of the artwork use conductive materials to trigger music-related algorithmic sequences. C, having audience members play a game where the position and type of game pieces on a board direct a performer's actions for creating music. Example, moving a pawn to a specific piece on a chessboard might indicate one action for the performer, while moving a bishop to the same location might indicate another. D, or engaging in algorithmic dancing by using a computer's camera to analyze motion and trigger sequences that correspond to a dancer's specific movements, end quote. So I want to provide an example for B, which is on touching artwork. So you can use conductive ink to paint a painting, and then add in like a makey or microbit or something to the back of it. Have those wires connect into a computer, and then you could have it so that when you touch different parts of a painting, it makes different sound or music. So one of the music education students that I formerly worked with painted a picture of Peter and the Wolf that had like the different animals from the story, and when you would touch the different animals, it would play the theme music for that particular animal. So that's one example of being able to touch artwork to make music that I think is a really interesting intersection of not only music and CS, but also art. All right, so in the next subsection, I talk about coding practices in music education contexts. So for most music educators, that's a very foreign idea, even though they might look at the composing and performing practices and go, oh yeah, okay, that is making music. However, most music educators don't know how to program. So fortunately, there is a range between like text-based and block-based languages that allow you to kind of like jump in and get started with making music. And I've got some resources on my website for that, and I'll include links to those in the show notes. But there are some things that we need to consider whether you're engaging in the software coding practices or in the hardware practices that I mentioned earlier. So the next section is titled Unpacking Potential Implications and Considerations. And the first subsection is questioning the value of practices at the intersection of multiple academic disciplines. So while I think the intersection between CS and music is really interesting, obviously since I did a whole dissertation that basically explored it, and I'm doing a podcast on it, there are some scholars who suggest that, quote, the design and execution of block-based languages and platforms themselves may limit and frustrate meaningful music making for children. In particular, Payne and Ruthman discuss limitations from the types of blocks Scratch offers for creating music and sounds, as well as the inconsistent timing of music sequences running in parallel, i.e. at the same time. Given that platforms such as Scratch have music making and learning limitations, and platforms such as EarSketch have limited music production abilities compared to many modern DAWs, why would a popular musician choose to create music with code instead of through other mediums? End quote. So this is a question that I really think that both music educators and CS educators need to sit with. So yeah, you could engage in practices that blur these boundaries, like, well, instead of composing with pencil and paper, you could compose by coding. Okay, you could, but does that enhance the music making experience in any way? Or is it just a substitution? So if we think of the SAMR framework. So SAMR is a framework for thinking of like using technology or devices. And so the S is substitution, the A is augmentation, the M is modification, and the R is redefinition. So substitution when it comes to SAMR and music and coding might be, well, instead of composing in Sibelius, which is a music notation software, you could compose in Sonic Pi, where you write out lines of code that do the same composition. Augmentation might be, okay, well, instead of just writing out the notation on there in Sonic Pi, you can actually like shape the sound. You can make it a shorter sound, you can make it a longer sound, you can make it so it gradually gets louder and softer, etc. So it allows you to augment the sound capabilities in ways that you might not have been able to do with the other music software for writing music, composing. Modification might be, okay, not only can I compose music, but I can perform live while I'm doing it by writing out lines of code. So that allows you to do two things simultaneously. But a redefinition might be, okay, well, I could compose music with different control structures that allow me to create semi-improvised or aleatoric music based off of algorithmic sequences. So for example, I wrote a program for a randomized drum set. This drum set would play infinitely different beats and fills, and I had no idea what it would play. I just give it a different seed, a different number, and then it would play a completely different random set of beats, fills, etc. forever. That is not something that I can create with just a music notation software on its own. I had to have computer science practices and coding practices to be able to do that. That is a redefinition of engaging with music in ways that I could not have done by simply substituting out one piece of technology for another. So what I recommend is, yes, if you are going to explore the intersections of CS and music, totally recommend it. It's a lot of fun, but do so in ways that allow you to make music in ways that are not possible without that intersection of music and CS. Here's a quote from page 164. Quote, "Rather than using computer science practices to replicate already existing music making and music learning opportunities, educators interested in exploring the intersections of music technology and computer science should consider how the intersections of popular musicianship and computer science practices might afford new forms of music engagement that would otherwise be impossible without the incorporation of computer science practices." End quote. And a little bit further down on page 165, quote, "In other words, the coding practices enable a medium for making music that would otherwise be unavailable without the intersection of both music and computer science practices, and are therefore essential practices for anyone interested in creating similar music." End quote. Okay, so I provide some more examples of some of the projects that I've created or seen other people create that kind of explore this intersection, but the next subsection is titled "When Are Music Practices?" So here's a little quote from page 166. Quote, "Consider the code someone might type during an algo rave. Is the final code a music composition or residue of the performance itself? Although a person might be able to run the final iteration of code to listen to music, i.e. a composition, it will likely lack the development and alterations over time that resulted in an expression heard by an audience, i.e. a performance. In such a scenario, we might consider code as both performance and composition, depending on the context. But what about the code that creates music software rather than the music and sound made with such software?" End quote. So on the next page, I basically describe how when I created one of the programs that I shared on there that allowed me to record and loop back a few different tracks of myself performing something, and it was quantized to a metronome that I had programmed, the vast majority of my time was spent sitting in front of a computer, engaging in practices that people might not consider to be music related because I was just programming. Maybe like 5% of the time I'd actually try out the software, perform something, see how it worked, try to find bugs, etc., and then went back to programming. However, when engaging this process and like the infinite drum set that I made, etc., I would argue that all of it was for musical purposes and engaged in musical thinking, problem solving, etc., and it just happened to be through the medium of programming. So because of this, I think it is more than relevant to music educators in particular who might be skeptical about, yeah, well, you're not really making much music. Okay, you're correct, but you are thinking about music. You're applying your concepts and musical understandings throughout the entire process. So from my perspective, it is very relevant to music educators. So if you do have any friends who are music educators who are skeptical about this intersection, feel free to have them listen to this article or read the article or even reach out to me. All three of my degrees are music education. I've worked with every grade, kindergarten through doctoral student in music education, in ensembles, general music, music education, etc. contexts. So hopefully that background kind of helps music educators go, oh, Jared's one of us, and they say that this is related to music. Maybe I should listen. Because quite frankly, some music educators are pretty skeptical about this, especially if it comes from somebody who's only done computer science and doesn't have a background in music education. All right, so the next subsection is on connecting practices. Now, basically, this section summarizes something that I found in my dissertation, in that the people who were posting on chipmusic.org were engaging in a variety of practices, and they'd oscillate back and forth between them. So one day they might be composing, the next day they might be engaging in hardware modification practices, and then the next day they might be programming software, and that could even all kind of alternate in the course of an hour, jumping back and forth between them. So that contrasts pretty heavily with what typically happens in schools, where you have a music class and you have a computer science class, and those two don't really interact together. If you were to engage in these practices in a holistic way, you'd be able to jump back and forth between them. So maybe I'm performing 1 minute, and then the next minute, maybe I'm programming. But the amount of time that you spend on one versus the other really kind of makes me question, well, where would this occur? Should it occur in a music education class? Should it occur in a computer science class? What about the intersection of the two? Could you form a new interdiscipline? So a discipline that is a merger of CS and music making. So you're engaging in both. If you were to do that, by connecting these practices, whose standards would you use for that? In my dissertation, I point out that, well, the music education standards don't really get at most of the hardware and software practices going on, but the computer science standards don't really get at most of the performing and composing practices that are going on. So do you combine the two, or do you make something new? And I kind of unpack this a little bit more in the final section of this paper on further considerations for music educators. But I guess one thing that I'd like to leave on that I kind of talk about at the very end is, quote, educators interested in music-related engagement that incorporates practices from a multitude of academic disciplines may need to collaborate with experts outside music to integrate or co-teach new curricular offerings that encourage development and application of understandings across multiple academic disciplines. When creating new classes or collaborating with experts from multiple academic disciplines, educators should take care to ensure no discipline is in a subservient relationship to another, but maintains co-equal status, end quote. So a subservient relationship for like music educators might say, okay, well, we're going to do this intersection of CS and music, and we're doing this to increase enrollment numbers in our CS courses because we think it's engaging and will interest students. But the real purpose is all about increasing numbers in CS, not necessarily to make music. So it's important for us to consider what Bressler calls that co-equal integration, where rather than making it so like CS is subservient to music or music is subservient to CS, that we have this like interdiscipline where both work together in a symbiotic relationship. You can't have one without the other, and they're both weighted equally. If you're interested in learning more about that kind of integration, maybe I'll do an Unpacking Scholarship episode on Bressler's paper that talks about this, and I'll relate it to CS education and integration. I think it is an important thing to consider. There are many flavors of integration that we can do, especially on the intersections of music and CS, and some of them are problematic, while others are less problematic. So I like to end these Unpacking Scholarship episodes with lingering questions or thoughts that I have, but because I wrote this, I don't really have much because it was already in my head. I guess the question that I might ask for the field is, how might scholars and educators from both domains work together to develop a new interdiscipline, or to engage in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary practices that are co-equal rather than subservient? And by the way, the articles that I'm citing that I would describe as subservient relationships, I don't think was intentionally trying to position one domain in a subservient relationship with the other for malicious purposes, but it certainly can come across that way unintentionally, assumingly, if the purpose is to serve one domain over another. And I get it that grant funding likely had a say into why this relationship was used, but there are other ways of collaborating across domains that I think we could explore more. And speaking of other domains, the last question that I have is, what other intersections work well with CS? One of the really interesting things about video game development in general is it involves so much other disciplines like art, sound, music, animation, physics, kinesiology, all sorts of really interesting domains that can intersect with CS. So should we create interdisciplines for those as well? Or do we consider CS as inherently interdisciplinary? But are those examples that I provided in relation to video game design and development, is that the same kind of interdisciplinary connections that people try and use when they are crowbarring CS into other subject areas? And if we are going to consider many other forms of engagement in interdisciplinary contexts, how can we make sure that this is not putting CS in a subservient relationship with that discipline? So for example, when we're integrating CS into math or ELA or science or whatever, is it just to cover the standards of CS, but the real purpose is just to learn ELA, math, etc.? If so, that's problematic. And going back to the SAMR framework, are we just doing it in ways that are substitutions and augmentations? Or are we modifying or redefining these disciplines through CS? I don't really have answers. It's very situationally dependent. Even if you look at a curriculum that might be one way, you could teach it a different way. So I just am raising these thoughts as things to consider, and feel free to disagree with them. And you can even come on the podcast and tell me why you disagree with them, which you can do by pressing the Contact Me button on my website at jaredoleary.com, which again has all the show notes for this podcast, as well as a ton of CS-related resources and some more drumming and gaming content. So check it out if you haven't. But that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. If you'd be so kind, please consider sharing a review or sharing with somebody else, and stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.